Every single leader in Star Wars Unlimited falls into a few categories. There's the usual suspects who fill up the top of the meta, the leaders with a single decent deck, the ones you wouldn't even pick in draft, and pretty much everything in between. Many of these exact rankings are up for debate, but most people wouldn't push me on the fact that IG-88 belongs way down here. There are a lot of reasons for IG-88's low ranking. Deploying at 5 is fine, but it's not exactly fast enough to be an upside, and his stat line is actively bad. It leaves him vulnerable not just to removal, but trades with most other leaders. But there is one thing that IG-88 has going for him that not a single other leader has. He is a droid. Yeah, we're really scraping the bottom of the barrel here, but the goal is going to be to craft a deck that makes full use of this fact while also playing as many generically good droid cards as possible to make up for our admittedly mediocre leader. To do this, we'll be playing green. IG-88 yellow is also an option for a slightly more straightforward aggro deck, but green gives us access to a number of options that are hard to say no to, including ECL. We'll also get access to the new Invisible Hand, which is a large part of why I'm revisiting this list after working on it on and off for several sets now. I'm really hoping that this card will function as a bit of a floor racer, maybe alleviating the deck's tendency to run out of gas in slower matchups, and it will also give us a big body that can put pressure on the space arena, which is something that IG-88 hasn't always been great at. Invisible Hand will allow us to search the top 10 cards of our deck for a droid and draw it. If that droid costs 2 or less, we'll get to play it for free, but even just the draw is a continuous source of card advantage, since this ability triggers both on play and on every attack. At 6 resources, Invisible Hand is a primary target for ECL, which will allow us to trigger the ability twice in one turn, in addition to getting a pretty well-statted ambush attack. I'm very high on this card right now, but that's mostly for the source of draw in this deck specifically, and the stat line, since almost all droids in these colors that cost 2 or less are absolutely terrible. I'll get into this a little bit more later in the video, but this is honestly the main thing holding the deck back. I did eventually settle on running Obedient Vanguard and Viper Probe Droid, but more often than not, we'll be passing up on our free targets in favor of just drawing a stronger droid that we actually need as we move into the mid to late game. It can absolutely be tempting to entirely flood the deck with cheap droids, but running more than a couple begins to compromise your ability to have a strong early game, since they're also understated for the most part, and this deck absolutely needs to come out the gate swinging. So instead of running more 2-cost droids, the rest of our turn 1 plays will be enablers for an exploit package. IG-88 really likes having a lot of units out, and we really like playing big bodies for cheap, so regardless of our ability to exploit immediately, getting some tokens out is a decent play. Our exploit payoffs come in the form of Squadron of Vultures and Heavy Persuader Tank, both of which come out as early as turn 2. Squadron of Vultures does join the long list of things in this deck that die to open fire, which is absolutely something to keep in mind, but if either of these units stick, you can absolutely run away with games before your opponent actually remembers they're playing against IG-88. A Heavy Persuader Tank also has a fairly useful ping ability that can finish off weak or damaged targets, and it has a slightly better stat line, so it's worth considering 3 copies, but we'll talk about that later. Running an exploit package leaves us in a bit of an odd spot for the rest of our turn 2 options though, since we're not exactly running enough exploit payoffs to really be all in on the strategy, but we are hoping to exploit on turn 2 often enough that the rest of our turn 2 plays need to be cards we're fairly comfortable playing later in the game. That comes in the form of a variety of cards that, unlike the rest of the deck, actually see play in real decks. Super Laser Tech, for example, gives us some flexibility. We can ramp in scenarios where it wasn't safe to exploit, or in matchups where we really want to deploy IG-88 a turn early, but pretty much everything else we're running at 3 cost impacts the board immediately. A Dark Trooper is a pretty strong sentinel that gets bigger if it starts winning trades, which of course protects our base from go face strategies, as well as protecting vulnerable units we want to keep alive. A droid commando is a virtually guaranteed ambush attack, since every single one of our turn 1 plays either are separatists or generate separatist battle droid tokens. And at 4/3, droid commando is one of the best and most underrated cards in the deck. It can neutralize almost any early play in the meta and can stick to the board against most of them, allowing it to trade up or trade 2 for 1 very often. We're also running Huyang, since putting 2/2 on a unit that can swing immediately is usually pretty good, especially if that target is something like a Dark Trooper or one of our big exploit bodies. And then in space, we'll be running Magna Guard Wing Leader, which I think is one of the most interesting cards in the deck, although I won't say it's one of the best. This card is one of the enablers for all of our droid units, in addition to Invisible Hand. It allows us to swing 2 droids for 1 action without tapping the Wing Leader itself, which on its own is a fairly respectable 3/4 for 3 in space. When the stars align, this is the best card in the deck, allowing us to swing for huge amounts of burst damage when we have the initiative before the opponent gets a chance to react. But, more often than not, admittedly, the stars do not align, since playing this on turn 2 means we're not playing a big droid. And on the flip side, exploiting turn 2 means we're not playing this, and we typically don't want to play this card on turn 3, which means typically this doesn't end up hitting the board until mid-game, at which point a shockingly fast kill isn't exactly in the cards. This card would be much better if there was a better pool of strong 2-cost droids with big bodies instead of just exploit enablers, but even as it stands, I am keeping it in the list, partially because of the ability's upside, but mostly because that stat line in space is really important for keeping certain decks from getting out of control. Our 4-cost cards are Relentless Rocket Droid and General's Guardian. Our philosophy from here on out is going to continue to be that raw stats are valuable above all else, and Rocket Droid does provide that. We'll have more than enough troopers for most of the game to keep this as a 5/5 for 4 in the majority of cases, and if IG-88 is alive, stacking Raid on top of that can turn this into quite the beater. General's Guardian is a slightly worse stat line and a card that I've included in the list relatively recently, so I'm not really sure how I feel about it, but it does generate more tokens to make sure that we're keeping a higher unit count than our opponent, and it fills up a part of our curve that honestly there aren't as many great options for. IG-88, on the other hand, is another big body as well as a pilot. This new mechanic from set 4 is pretty good here because not only are all of our space units vehicles, but so is Heavy Persuader Tank, which has a ping ability to make sure that there's actually a damaged unit out there when we want to swing in. This is of course a 7 attack droid if we want to just play it as a ground unit, and if we want to pilot something like a tank, it does not take long to do some serious damage. For 6-cost cards, we've already talked about the Invisible Hand, but we're also going to be playing a single copy of Kalani. This is one of the areas where my personal bias has perhaps affected the list most, since I absolutely love this card. I go back and forth on whether it's completely broken or too clunky to be useful, but the ability to ECL this with initiative can be a massive play. I will admit that it's most likely better to be running a 3rd copy of some of the cards that are a little more broadly useful, but my personal list does include 1 copy of Kalani still. Your mileage may vary. The last unit, of course, is Darth Vader, which feels like a pretty self-explanatory piece of the list, but was actually one of the most recent additions that I didn't put in until I started writing this video. I have to admit that when I'm making decks, I have a strong tendency to go with theme above viability, mostly unintentionally, and the lack of a droid tag doesn't actually really matter here, but it did cause me to overlook Darth Vader for a concerning amount of time. I don't really need to tell you why this card is good, but I will tell you that with the traffic jam there is at the 3-cost spot in this deck, there are plenty of excellent things to summon with Darth Vader, so the inclusion is pretty obvious. Now, you may have noticed it took me quite a while to get through all the units. I'm a recovering green player in MTG, as well as a recovered Hearthstone player that played a concerning amount of Hunter, so it took me multiple iterations of this deck list to get the unit count below 45, but I have eventually elected to run some events, although probably still not quite as many as I should be. We've already discussed droid deployment a little bit, or at least I showed it as part of our exploit package. I counted it as a unit since that's basically what it is, but we're also running a complex removal package that consists of open fire and we're running open fire at least now, and overwhelming barrage. We're definitely light on removal. The removal we do have is mostly just to take out space units we don't quite have an answer for. But this is, to be blunt, not a value deck that can afford to slow down very much, and we're usually happier taking trades than playing direct removal. In that vein, I am also running 2 copies of Timely Intervention to round the deck out, which gives us more ambush attacks to keep our opponent's board state in check while still building up our board as actively as possible. So now that we've gone through the entire list, there are a few leftover questions. What does this pile of garbage do well, and what does it need to be truly viable? This deck is absolutely nothing if not a work in progress, but it does actually have some kick to it. The exploit package allows you to get out in front of decks that are used to having the upper hand through the early game, and if you can follow that up with some decent supporting pieces through the mid game and good stats for cost until you can get Invisible Hand out, you can find yourself going toe-to-toe with some extremely good decks. Invisible Hand allows you to play more cheap cards without running out of resources, and not only are you drawing extra cards, you're filtering your deck to make sure that you actually draw what you need. But what this deck is really lacking is a plan B, an untimely open fire on your squadron of vultures, or an untimely removal piece on some of your cheaper supporting units, or just some bad trades can be enough to derail the entire deck. And Invisible Hand can help right the ship, so to speak, through the endgame, but you're still lacking a lot of resilience compared to many of the decks you're going to have to compete with. I know I'm supposed to be acting as a bit of a salesman here. I'm supposed to be selling you on the idea that this deck is good, but that's just not convincing. Instead, I want to sell you on the idea that this deck is just a few pieces away. And most of those pieces are relevant 2-cost droids. The 2 cheap droids we're currently running are arguably some of the weakest cards in the deck, and the remainder of our turn 1 plays are exploit enablers with low stat lines. Printing a droid equivalent to something like Battlefield Marine would instantly skyrocket this deck's viability, allowing it not only to cheat out more meaningful units later in the game, but also take a more aggressive approach in games where you can't play for an early exploit. I'm not saying they should print a literal droid version of Battlefield Marine, but that's just an example. Something along those lines sure would not hurt. In the meantime, there are a lot of cards that I haven't actually mentioned as part of my list that you should strongly consider running. Cutting Super Laser Tech in favor of more early game dominance could work, or you could just go all in on ramp and run resupply. I've also taken a look at Confederate Tri-Fighter to cancel out any healing that we might have to deal with. B1 Attack Platform and Droid Missile Platform have relatively high attacks, so they're worth looking at, and I'm sort of interested by the idea of General's Blade, which would be fantastic if you could get it on Hu Yang, but that is the only Jedi on the deck, so your odds would not be great. Safe to say this video is more of a theory crafting session than a proper deck tech, but I still insist I'm onto something. Invisible Hand seems like a good card that'll probably be a lot more useful in a shell that's already a bit closer to viability like Dooku Blue, but IG-88 is only a good spoiler day or two away from taking a lot of people by surprise. Before I go, that was supposed to be the end of the video, but there are 2 cards I want to talk about really quickly just because they just announced them today as I was putting the final touches on this video. So I'm delaying the video a little bit because both of these cards are probably going to be pretty influential to both this list and droid lists in general. If you want to be playing a droid synergy deck, you're probably going to want to take a look at Swarming Vulture Droid. Not because it's particularly great, I don't know if it's strong or not, but it sure is interesting. This card is really cool because you can run 15 copies of it, and each swarming vulture droid gets +1 attack for every other swarming vulture droid that you have on the board. So if you manage to get a whole ton of these out, they're going to be very deadly. The problem for this list specifically is that if you don't have a whole ton of them out, a 2-2 for 2 is not particularly impressive. This doesn't really help us with a turn 1 aggressive play. It's only in the later turns, once you get multiple out, where this really starts to get impressive. For that reason, I don't think running 15 copies of Swarming Vulture Droid is the answer to this deck's problems. I think you could potentially make the argument for running a decent amount. You could obviously take the entire deck in a different direction and really build around Swarming Vulture Droid. I don't know if it's going to be good or not, but you certainly could. As the list currently is, you can make the argument for removing Obedient Vanguard and the Probe Droid in favor of this. I'm certainly considering it, but anything beyond that, I'd kind of question. If you want to cut a couple of the other cards that I kind of just included because I'm biased towards them, like Kalani, I think that's fair. Running about 8 copies of this card probably wouldn't impact the list too negatively, but I think anything more than that, you're going to really have to rehaul the entire deck. The other card is Invincible, which obviously is not particularly applicable to IG-88 Green, but that's kind of the problem. IG-88 Green is not going to be playing a yellow card, but I would keep an eye on General Grievous, because I think General Grievous could potentially make use of a lot of this deck's strengths while also getting access to things like Invincible. So just in light of this card's announcement, I thought I'd point out that General Grievous probably has slightly better chances of actually having a meta impact.